Hey everyone! Today we are going to finish our read aloud of A Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors by reading chapters 33, 34, and 35. The links to the rest of these videos are in the description, so if you missed the first ones, you can find them there. In the meantime, let's jump in and charge towards the end. Chapter 33, The Game Concluded. How were they going to do it? How could they kill him without killing him? He couldn't close his eyes without picturing a dozen possibilities. Hiring a human assassin was the most obvious option to him. If the twins used magic to keep his guards from protecting him, would that make them culpable, even if they themselves didn't deal the death blow? The bigger question plaguing him was if his death would be vengeance enough to satisfy them. It was clear to him that they were tired of Calathea. The game lost its appeal when the people stopped playing. Yet they were too arrogant to lose or call a draw. They had to win before they could leave. His head throbbed, his heart raced. He paced back and forth across the prison. He wanted to think about anything else. He was almost grateful when he saw the twins standing by the door watching him. "Is there something I can do for you?" he asked. "We were going to ask you the same thing," Acacia offered. The rage had left them, and they both had the same calm, confident expressions he was so accustomed to. "You seem a bit nervous." "Do I?" Alexander answered dryly. "I can't imagine why." "You know, I sort of like you," Jace smiled. "Just a few hours ago you said you hated me," Alexander corrected. "Oh, I do," Jace affirmed. "But I like you also. It's complicated." "We like hating you," Acacia clarified. "I think it's a shame we have to kill you," Jace added, "but, well, those insolent subjects of yours need to be punished somehow, so there's really no way around it, I'm afraid." "The more you talk, the more I look forward to it," Alexander answered. Acacia ignored his sarcasm. "We aren't completely heartless," she said sweetly, "so we've come to offer you one last request." "We can give you anything your heart desires," Jace answered. "I don't see how this could possibly be a trap," Alexander remarked. "What trap?" Acacia shrugged. "We are already killing you. What are you so afraid of?" "I won't play." "Even if we told you we'd let you see that queen of yours?" Alexander felt a deep ache in his chest. There wasn't anything in the world he wanted more. He turned to face the prison wall, praying he wouldn't make a foolish choice. After a long moment, he turned back to face them. "Kindly leave my prison," Alexander replied. "You are so boring," Acacia sighed. Alexander had never been so glad to hear anything. "I know," he smirked. "Good night." They disappeared. Alexander stooped down and undid his sandals, and then he curled up on the cold floor. He fell asleep feeling a strange combination of terrified and triumphant. Alexander woke the next morning to a kick in the ribs. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Jace declared cheerily. "Are you ready to die?" "I hope so," Alexander replied, stretching groggily. "We mortals should always be ready to die." He looked down at himself, and saw that, once again, he was wearing his royal garments. Only now, the fairies had neglected to put anything on his feet. "Put your shoes on. Everyone's waiting," Jace ordered. Alexander looked up at Jace with one eyebrow raised. Then Jace pointed to the floor, where two pairs of shoes rested side by side. The first was a pair of thick leather riding boots. They were almost knee-high and laced all the way up the front. The second pair were formal shoes with a slightly pointed toe. They were the kind of shoes he normally wore in the royal court, and ones that matched his current attire. Alexander furrowed his brow. He looked at Jace and then back down at the shoes. What kind of game was this? He sighed. It didn't matter. He wasn't going to play. Instead, he took his sandals from the place he had left them the night before and started putting them on. "Don't be stupid, Your Majesty," Jace warned. Alexander ignored him. "What will you do with my sister?" he asked. He wasn't expecting an answer, but he did wonder. Surely they didn't want the burden of caring for a mortal as they went off to wreak havoc in some other part of the world. Jace grinned. "A better question is, What will your wife do to her? Alexander looked at Jace curiously. Poor Ilona, she's such a passionate woman. She'll want to avenge you. And who is more deserving of punishment than Fausta? You, Alexander replied. I was only Fausta's humble adviser, Jace grinned. Alexander rolled his eyes and decided not to press the matter further. So the twins were going to release Fausta, or at least hand her over to Ilona. Would Ilona punish her? Could Ilona punish her? Did the Senate know about Fausta's crimes? He was suddenly struck with a horrifying thought. What if Ilona had Fausta executed for high treason? The idea of his wife having his sister killed made him sick to his stomach. Suddenly, Alexander found himself blinking in the morning sunlight. He was standing in a little valley. It must not have been far from the city, for people were crowding and surrounding the hillsides. He recognized many of them. He guessed some magic was preventing them from entering the valley itself. He noticed his sister standing a few paces away. Acacia was gripping her arm, preventing her from approaching. She must have known there was no way to break free from that grasp, but she kept struggling, unable to stifle the anxiety she felt for him. Your Majesty, Jace said, drawing Alexander's attention back to him. You'll need this. He was offering Alexander a sword. Alexander took it and held it, inspecting it. I'm guessing this removes your culpability, he questioned, and then he slowly swung it over Jace's shoulder, stopping it just as the blade came to rest against his neck. Or are you hoping I'll attempt to cut your head off so you can kill me without consequence? Jace was completely unfazed. He didn't even flinch at the weapon's touch. If you choose not to defend yourself, that's nothing to me, he shrugged. Alexander lowered his weapon. So this was it. They were going to pit him against someone or something. Whoever or whatever it was, the twins were confident it would defeat him. Jace glanced backward over his shoulder. In the hillside, directly behind him, Alexander noticed a cave. It was partially hidden behind a patch of bushes. It wasn't a vast opening, but certainly large enough to house a bear or lion or some other flesh-eating creature. Alexander's heart pounded as the reality of his situation hit him. Where is the cultic princess? Jace called. Here, Ilona called, appearing atop the hill. Jace opened his mouth to address her, but Ilona cut him off. No. You don't even know what I'm going to say, Jace protested. You're about to tell me you'll spare my husband's life if I fall at your feet and beg your forgiveness and kiss your perfect little toes. How is it you know me so well? Jace exclaimed. You're boring and predictable. Stop talking and get on with it, she replied. Alexander tore his eyes from the cave and looked up at her. He could tell she was exhausted. Her eyes were red and puffy and framed by dark circles. Despite this, she stood up straight with her head high, staring at Jace with a defiance even the fairy couldn't match. Ilona, Alexander called. Thank you. When she met his gaze, her eyes went glassy. She opened her mouth to reply, but then closed it and responded with a nod. Jace gave Alexander's shoulder a squeeze. I'll leave you at the mercy of Calathea's deadliest creature. Good luck. He sprinted away and flopped down at the base of one of the hills. His sister followed suit, pulling Fausta along with her. Alexander gripped his blade, locking his eyes on the cave. Why hadn't the creature appeared? Were they holding it back by magic until now? Unconsciously, he took a step back. What was Calathea's deadliest creature? He thought of every wild beast that could possibly come charging at him from the darkness. The crowd was completely still, all holding their breath. Alexander kept moving backward, wanting to put as much distance between himself and the cave as possible. The valley was full of shrubs and brambles that scratched his feet and snagged his clothing. Then, something struck his ankle, causing a horrible stinging pain deep in his flesh. He jumped, glancing down to see a rock viper with its fangs buried in his skin. He swept it in the air with his blade, sending it soaring away in 2 pieces. He slowly lifted his hem and stared in shock at the 2 tiny drops of blood running down his leg. He noticed movement on the ground a short distance away. The tail of a second viper, a smaller one, was disappearing into the underbrush. Watch your step, Jace called playfully. Alexander laughed bitterly at his own foolishness. Calathea's deadliest creature. Of course, this was prime territory for vipers, and it looked as if he'd stumbled into a nest. He had chosen, of his own free will, to walk through the brush in the Calathean countryside in sandals. It was a foolish mistake, one that anyone could have made. He wasn't watching his feet, he was looking at a cave that was probably empty. Do you feel like you've won? He called. We absolutely have, Jace sneered. I offered you protection, didn't I? But you didn't want to play. You're very clever, Alexander quipped. He felt a throbbing pain building beneath the wound. He looked around for Ilona. She had made her way down the hill and was standing presumably as close to him as the twins would allow. Alexander checked the ground again. He wasn't sure why. A second bite couldn't make things much worse. Do you have any idea how easy it would be for us to heal you? Acacia mentioned. Alexander ignored her and, swallowing his pain, sprinted towards Ilona. Ah, good. Run around, Jace commented. It will spread the venom faster. Alexander was a few paces from Ilona when he found himself stopped by some invisible force. It was like the air tightened around him and wouldn't release him until he had ceased struggling against it. He stood for a moment, waiting to catch his breath. He couldn't. His heart raced, his hands trembled, and that awful burning pain shot up his ankle and touched every part of his body. He looked at Ilona and somehow managed to smile. It's wonderful to see you again. Alex, she began, and then paused as she struggled to hold back her tears. One escaped, and then another. Alexander hugged himself with his arms as if it would stop the shaking. Ilona, he breathed. It's worth it. I know, she mouthed. Alexander suddenly felt like his skin was boiling. A surge of pain and dizziness overcame him, and he crumpled to the ground. He was aware of people talking, calling, shouting all around him. He recognized Fosta's voice. She was arguing with the twins, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. The pain increased, and soon he couldn't comprehend anything else. It was unclear how long he remained in this state. Each moment was like an eternity. Alex, came Ilona's voice. He felt her hand touch his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked up at her. She was kneeling on the ground beside him. They let you? Alexander managed. They're hoping you will convince me to surrender, she whispered. They're pathetic. She sat down among the brambles and pulled him up into her arms so that she was cradling him across her lap. He took a fistful of her cloak and gripped it so hard he almost ripped it from her shoulders. After a time, he felt a tingling numbness creeping up his leg. The pain began to subside, and his head cleared slightly. There was something he wanted to tell her, something critically important. He was confused. Each breath took a conscious effort. He wished his heart would stop racing for a moment. He wished he could breathe deeply and focus, just for a moment more. It had something to do with what Jace said before he brought him here. Spare Fosta, Alexander pleaded. Ilona looked surprised to hear him speaking, or maybe she was surprised by what he asked. Alex, she whispered. No one is to harm her, Alexander insisted. His head cleared a bit as he lost feeling in his leg entirely. This is my last command as king. Make sure the Senate and the people know. Of course you'd ask that, Ilona sniffed. Do you have any malice in you? Are you human? Don't misunderstand me, he pressed. Put her in prison. Just don't execute her. I don't trust her, and I couldn't stop resenting her if I lived another 100 years, but... He paused for a moment, trying to catch his breath. But for reasons that are beyond me, I still love her. Ilona leaned in and kissed his forehead. All right, she agreed. I will tell them for you. She wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand. Alexander smiled weakly. He felt tears on his own cheeks. He wasn't afraid to die, but hated to leave her alone. Fosta's betrayal, his banishment, and everything he suffered in between was worth it because it gave him the chance to know her. He wished he could say something to express the joy he felt being close to her again. Fosta looked on from a distance, wondering what they were saying to each other. They spoke for a long time, completely lost in each other, smiling and weeping all at once. Finally, Alexander ceased speaking and lay in her arms with his eyes closed and his lips slightly parted as he struggled to breathe. Ilona continued speaking to him, even though he couldn't reply.
It was unclear to Fosta how long it took for the venom to complete its cruel task. Each moment stretched on endlessly. Even the twins lost patience and took turns leaving and coming back, sometimes stopping to speak to one another about what they were going to do next. Fosta hated them to her very core. At last, Ilona stopped speaking and held Alexander silently as a fresh wave of tears flooded her cheeks. She kissed his forehead and then laid him on the ground, gently brushing a stray curl away from his face. Then she stood and looked at the twins. At once the tenderness left her eyes, replaced at once by a burning fury. "Are you happy?" she hissed. "Are you?" Acacia mocked. "Why the tears? We've returned him to you. Isn't that what you wanted?" Jace sneered. He approached her and tried to brush a droplet from her cheek. She snatched his wrist and held it, as if she was going to crush it in her fist. He pulled his hand free with a playful laugh. Ilona hugged herself with one arm. It looked almost as if she was trying to keep herself from lunging forward and ripping him apart with her bare hands. Acacia looked at Fosta and smiled sweetly. "And we've given you what you wanted, too. Your brothers are both dead. That makes you queen, doesn't it? No one can say we aren't generous." "Assuming the Senate doesn't have her executed for high treason," Jace pointed out. "Did we ever tell them about that?" Fosta buried her face in her hands. She had killed him. It didn't matter that she hadn't dealt the death blow. Alexander was dead because of her. She had killed her little brother, Calathea's greatest king. Fosta tore away from the twins and ran toward a group of senators that was sitting together on the hillside. She was able to reach them unhampered. Before them and all the people, she confessed her crimes and begged to be treated as a traitor. The people murmured among themselves while the senators argued about what should be done. The twins watched the chaos with delighted expressions. Then a single voice ran out from the valley. It was a soft and pleasant voice that somehow overcame the confusion and brought every soul to silence. "I'm sorry he killed you," it said. Fosta turned from the senators to look at the speaker. He was a bent old monk with a weather-worn face. He had the darkest skin of anyone she'd ever seen, and deep brown eyes that gleamed with a joyous sparkle. A viper slithered around his arms and over his calloused hands. He looked at the creature with a broad, warm smile. The snake looked up at him, its red tongue flickering curiously. The old man stroked the viper on the head. "He was frightened, you know, just like you were." At the sight of the old man, the haughtiness left the twins. They stood petrified, making no attempt to hide their terror. The old monk stooped down and let the reptile slither into the brush. "Go finish napping. I'll make sure no one else steps on you." He straightened up and smiled at the twins. "Well done." "What are you talking about?" Acacia snapped. Getting one human to practice virtue is hard enough, but look what you've done." He looked around at the people on the hillside. "You've united the cults and the Calatheans." He looked at Fosta. She wanted to look away, but found she couldn't tear her gaze from those gentle eyes. "You've taught the ruthless how to love." He looked at Ilona, and then at Alexander. "And you've made the virtuous heroic." "You're wrong," Jace protested. "You know I'm not," the old man smiled. "If making people better bothers you so much, why don't you sulk off and be on your own for a while?" "Don't you have a war to fight?" Acacia accused. "Of course not," the old monk replied. "I never fight." The twins both went scarlet with rage. Never had Fosta seen their hatred so plainly, nor their fear. They vanished without a word. The old monk turned and began walking toward Alexander. Fosta raced down the hill after him, her heart pounding. As the old man passed Ilona, he gave her shoulder a little squeeze. He knelt down beside Alexander's body and placed a hand on his cold forehead. "Don't think you can get out of ruling so easily, my king." The color returned to Alexander's cheeks. His chest rose and fell, and he started murmuring. "Neglecting my duty? What are you talking about?" Alexander mumbled something else incoherent and then added, "Fine, father, I'll go back, but just for a little while." Alexander opened his eyes, and Ilona burst into tears all over again. He stared into the face of the old man for a moment with a slightly dazed expression. Then his eyes lighted with recognition, and to Fosta's surprise, he scowled. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. I'm sorry, my king, the old man replied. I was protecting war orphans from— No, stop, Alexander ordered, holding up a hand. Just once I want to be angry at you without feeling guilty about it. Amusement twinkled in the old monk's eyes. All right, go ahead. Tell me when you're feeling better. Alexander scowled for a moment longer, then seemed to give up. I can't do it, he sighed. The old monk helped him to his feet. Alexander was hardly standing a moment when Ilona threw her arms around his neck and hugged him so tightly that Fausta worried she was going to snap him in two. Then he kissed the barbarian princess in an uncourtly fashion that made Fausta purse her lips with disapproval. Chapter 34. Family and Other Complexities. Alexander walked across the white sand of the Calathean shore. Ilona was there beside him, her hand intertwined with his. It had only been a few days since they were reunited, and they couldn't bear to be apart. Alonzo was bounding in and out of the water like a little puppy, occasionally bringing Alexander bits of driftwood to throw for him. I am not convinced that's the same dog, Ilona mentioned. He just needed a bit of sunlight to revive him, Alexander smiled. I have some ideas about how we can repair the cathedral, she said enthusiastically. I have spoken with a number of architects. They gave me all sorts of wonderful ideas. I think we should try to replicate the original facade, Alexander suggested. Oh no, Alex, the new one is going to be so much better. Not too modern, I hope, he inquired. He'll love it, she promised. Alexander was about to ask for more details when Ilona changed the subject. Did I tell you Florian is engaged? She said. Is he? Yes. Before he left, he swore to Damara that he'd marry her when he returned. Ilona went on. Does she get a say? Alexander quipped. No more than you did, Ilona returned. Alexander was happy for them. He hoped that Damara liked sharing quarters with dogs and livestock. He was about to ask when Florian was returning, when he spotted a messenger running toward them across the sand. My queen, he fell down on one knee before her, and after catching his breath said, Your brother has returned. Ilona's face brightened. Which one? She asked. The messenger opened his mouth to reply, then paused, and blushed. I think it is King Florian. Ilona took off toward the palace. Don't be so hard on yourself, Alexander mentioned to the messenger. It isn't because they're cultic. They do look exactly the same. He called Lonzo and started walking after Ilona. The throne room had a set of main doors at one end, where the guests and the public usually entered. Here and there, around the perimeter, smaller doors opened into the palace corridors. Alexander stayed back, watching through one of the smaller doorways as Ilona went ahead to meet her brother. He wanted to give her a moment with him before entering. The main gates opened and Florian arrived, followed by a company of noblemen. Alexander waited to witness the joyous reunion, but Florian's gait was slow and somber. Looking closer, he noticed tears glistening on the king's cheeks. Ilona was clearly puzzled by this. Florian, what's wrong? Florian wrapped his arms around her and said, Ilona, I'm so sorry. About what? Ilona asked. I've failed you, he confessed. Alexander emerged into the throne room and sprinted toward the king. What on earth has happened? He asked. A collective gasp ran through the king's company, and at the sound of Alexander's voice, Florian released his sister and spun toward him in astonishment. You, he exclaimed before charging forward and hugging Alexander so tight he almost cracked a rib. When he released him, Alexander fell into a heap, and his guards started over to assist him, but Alexander held up his hand. I'm all right, he insisted. He rubbed his side as he stood. This is how he shows affection. A messenger told me you were dead, Florian exclaimed. Ah, he must have left before brother Joseph returned, Alexander observed. It seems we have a lot to talk about. They welcomed Florian to a private terrace, where they offered him something to eat and told him everything that had happened. It took some time for the shock of seeing Alexander alive to wear off, but when it did, they spoke at length about the state of the kingdom and what the Calathians could do to thank the cults for their assistance. After a long time, Florian asked if Alexander would dismiss the servants who were attending them so they could speak privately. Did Ilona tell you about my engagement? Florian asked. He seemed nervous in a highly un-Florian-like way. She did. I'm very happy for you, Alexander replied. Ah, good. Damara recently told me something I think you should know about, Florian continued. Ilona leaned in suddenly, very interested. Do you know that Augustin is your nephew? Florian said. Alexander responded with a warm smile. He always knew that somewhere beneath under Florian's gruff exterior he had a good heart, but to think he wasn't even married yet and already considered Augustin his own son. I know, he answered. You do? Florian questioned. It was fairly obvious, Ilona added, with a slight eye roll and a knowing smile. Florian relaxed slightly. Ah, good. The conversation then moved to other things. When Filbert returned the following day, he almost murdered the three of them, for in their joy at being reunited, they forgot to send a messenger to inform him Alexander was still alive. Luckily, their victory put him in a forgiving mood. They spent a week together celebrating before Filbert and Florian decided to return home. Ilona hugged them both and promised she would see them again one day. Then the three of them cried and hugged some more. After everything Alexander had been through, being king didn't seem so difficult. Sometimes he even liked it. His duties didn't leave him with much leisure time, but when he found some, he would slip away and paint. Ilona would sit with him as he worked, writing letters and reviewing plans. Jace and Acacia had left the city in need of some serious repairs, which Ilona was delighted to oversee. During these moments, as they worked together quietly, Alexander almost felt like he was back in Caltahaven, a warm and sunny Caltahaven with a view of the ocean. There was only one thing that still troubled him. He tried to ignore it for over a year, but it was relentless in its nagging. One night he couldn't sleep, so he rose from his bed and paced the halls, pondering his predicament. A ways down the corridor, he noticed a dark figure standing in a pool of moonlight, looking out one of the windows, his hands clasped behind his back. As he got closer, he recognized Brother Joseph. The old monk greeted him with a smile. Can't sleep? The monk asked. Alexander released a defeated sigh. All right, I'll do it, Alexander said. Do what? Brother Joseph replied. I didn't say anything. I know why you're here, Alexander insisted. That's awfully presumptuous of you, the monk answered. First thing tomorrow, Alexander promised before turning back towards his room. My king, Brother Joseph called after him. Alexander paused and looked back over his shoulder at the old monk. It's as much for your good as it is for hers, he said. I know, Alexander answered. Chapter 35. Fausta, the Historian. Fausta twirled a reed pen in her fingers. She was looking out the window of the tower where she was imprisoned. She was outside the city proper, but she could see the skyline against the brightening horizon. She often found herself looking toward the palace and wondering about her brother's well-being. It had been a full year since she'd last seen him, and then he'd made an incredibly foolish decision. He had spared her life. Sort of. After she confessed to murder and high treason, among other things, there was no legal way for him to do it. She was technically condemned, but he insisted she help undo some of the damage she had done before her execution. First, she had to write a detailed account of everything that had happened, so that no one would ever repeat the same mistake. Second, she had to make 2 copies of every manuscript in Calathea's library. He was horrified to learn about Acacia's book burning, and wanted to ensure their texts would be preserved. Given the size of Calathea's library, these texts would take around 60 years to complete. That stupid, stupid boy, letting his sentimentality show. She was amazed he hadn't been overthrown already. Then again, he did have an uncanny ability to escape death. She heard the echo of footsteps, which came to a halt outside the thick wooden door that imprisoned her. It was probably Cleo or Zoe. They came now and then to bring her news from the palace. Damara came a few times too, before she left for Caltahaven with that barbarian king. She really did have terrible taste in men. But the visitor was neither Cleo nor Zoe. The door opened, revealing Alexander. He stood tall, with his head high and his shoulders back. His fingers were laced at his stomach, and he was tapping his thumbs together thoughtfully. That was something her father used to do, usually right before reprimanding her. She hated looking at him. It made her wonder how she could ever justify what she did. But she looked anyway. She had trained her whole life to avoid showing weakness, and to look anywhere else would have betrayed the guilt and humiliation she felt, so she endured it. My king, she greeted, and it felt incredibly strange to calling him that. He was looking at her the way he had on the day they were in prison together. The anger and hurt that burned in those eyes was agonizing. She wanted Earth to swallow her up. To what do I owe this honor? She asked. Her tone was pleasant and polite. Do you know a Norseman by the name of Ivan Eriksson? He asked. That was not what she expected. Honestly, she didn't know what she expected, but that certainly wasn't it. Yes, is he back again? Foster rolled her eyes. He seems to think we owe him a substantial sum of money. You wouldn't know anything about this, would you? He shows up every few years. Father was paying him to leave peacefully. Just torch his ships, Alex. That's what I was going to do, Foster replied. I'll take that into consideration, he replied. Alexander had asked her about a number of similar practicalities in the last year, always by letter or through a messenger. An uncomfortable moment passed in silence. He was regarding her with his brow furrowed. Foster could tell he was rehearsing whatever he was about to say next in his mind. She got tired of waiting. You came here to ask me about that? She questioned. No, just seeing you reminded me that is something I need to deal with today. He silently regarded her for another minute, and every second Fosta endured that gaze was an eternity. Fosta, he started. His voice was so incredibly gentle, and she tensed. That one word was like the prick of a blade that was about to impale her. Why couldn't he just lash out in anger like a normal person? It's the strangest thing. I can't feel angry at the twins, at least not deeply. When I think about what they did to me, I feel only pity. How miserable they must be, playing the same games over and over, century after century. How is it that I feel no resentment toward them? But whenever I look at you, I feel it so deeply. She wished he would stop talking and just beat her to a bloody pulp. You were like a mother to me. I loved you, and I still do, and as long as that remains true, this anger may never cease to torment me. Every word was agony. But you have confessed and will spend the rest of your life making reparations for your crime. It's done, and so I won't speak of it again. Alexander was going on. What are you saying, Alex? She realized she sounded irritated, but it was only because she was trying desperately to hold back tears. I forgive you, he answered. She responded with a little laugh, anything to hide her grief, then swung around toward the window and said casually, You're setting a bad precedent. A tear escaped her, then another. She was glad he couldn't see her face. How so? Alexander replied. I'm a traitor, Alexander. Sparing my life was bad enough, but if anyone found out you came here and saw me, they'd perceive you as weak, Foster replied. Foster felt more tears rolling down her cheeks. She managed to keep her voice even and firm. I don't want your advice, Foster, Alexander interrupted. I came here because I wanted to make sure you knew that I'd forgiven you. To her horror, she realized her nose was running, and that meant she was going to sniffle and betray herself. She wanted him to leave. Foster responded without a hint of emotion in her voice. Leave, Alex. She heard his footsteps moving away. Alex, she called without turning from the window. The footsteps paused. You aren't thinking of coming back again, are you? Because that would be extremely foolish. There was a moment of silence, and Alexander replied, Not for a while. As Alexander left the tower, he felt a deep ache in his heart. He had expected her to react by either joyfully accepting his forgiveness or lashing out in anger and rejecting it completely. She did neither. There wasn't any neat closure, and it was deeply unsatisfying. All he knew, in that moment, was that he wanted to be with Ilona. She wasn't feeling well, and had been sleeping when he left. He was hoping he wouldn't have to trouble her with any of this in her current state. He thought perhaps he'd slip into their room quietly and see if she was awake. She was, though, still lying in bed. She greeted him with a weary smile. He knelt down beside her and placed a tender hand on her cheek. Are you feeling better? He whispered. Much better, Ilona replied. I was just thinking of getting up. Alexander shook his head. She kept doing this, and it worried him. She would get extremely nauseous to the point where she couldn't keep anything down, and then it would pass and she would insist she was fine. She had been this way for weeks. He wondered if it was something she was eating. Don't do that, Alexander urged. It will only come back again. I am fine, really, she insisted. But I can see that you aren't. What's troubling you? Nothing I want to burden you with, he replied. Better you burden me with whatever it is than with the anxiety of not knowing, she answered. I went and saw Foster this morning, he said. That explains it, Ilona answered. She stretched and sat up, then patted the spot next to her. Alexander sat beside her on the bed. She didn't look sick. On the contrary, her face was almost radiant. Alexander puzzled over what kind of ailment could come and go as sporadically as this one. I take it didn't go so well, she asked. I offered my forgiveness. Ilona rolled her eyes. Of course you did, she said. Are you mocking me? Alexander asked. Only because you're a much better person than I'll ever be, she answered. That isn't true. Just continue your story, Ilona returned. What did she say? She told me I was soft, and I could be perceived as weak, Alexander replied. Ilona raised an eyebrow. Even from prison, she's telling you what to do. If I condemned her, she'd have lectured me straight to her death, Alexander sighed. And probably from beyond the grave, Ilona added. Death never stopped your father. Ilona had a way of making Alexander smile, even at the oddest moments. He sighed. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some human emotion, anger, tears. She was so pragmatic about the whole thing. If she rejected me, that would have been some sort of resolution at least. Well, you did what you could do, Ilona replied. You can't control what she does. Is there any truth in what she's saying? Alexander asked. Do the people see me as weak? She kissed him. Anyone who perceives you as weak has a very short memory. She lay back on the bed, rested her hand on her stomach, and smiled up at him playfully. You're a bit dense sometimes, though. Alexander furrowed his brow. He had no idea what she was talking about. It has been almost 1,000 years since Alexander died, for the second and final time. Fausta documented everything he did during his reign in great detail. In fact, her histories are the part of the reason we know so much about him today. How she kept herself informed from prison is something of a mystery, though scholars suspect a pair of talkative handmaidens had something to do with it. Calathea still stands. It's a wonderful place to visit. They have a beach resort there and lots of museums. If you have 2 euros and a couple hours to wait in line, you can even go down into the crypt where the Calathean kings are buried. There are quite a few Basils, Constantines, and Justins, but there is only one Alexander. You'll find him right between Basil the 14th and Constantine the Barbarian. Stay with your tour guide and do not duck under the barriers. The police are really tired of rescuing lost tourists and may decide to leave you wandering among the skeletons. When you're finished in Lysandria, take a bus to the monastery on Cedar Hill. It's hardly changed at all since Alexander's time, except that they've added a gift shop. There's an old monk there who likes to slip free candies to the tourist children. Many responsible adults have tried to dissuade him to no avail. After all, he was doing that sort of thing long before Alexander was born, and will continue doing it long after you're dead. The end. We did it. We made it through the whole book. Thank you so much for joining me for this read aloud and for putting up with my little slip-ups and mistakes. I hope you enjoyed the book. If you did, there actually is a sequel to this book called Rosalind's Curse, and if I get enough requests, I might do a read aloud of this one. So let me know in the comments if you would like me to do that read aloud. In the meantime, thanks so much for joining me for this one, and I will see you next time.